We're nearing the end of our video series on color schemes in Sublime Text. We've learned a fair bit of information, what they are, a little bit about how they work, and in last week's video, we covered the many different ways we could choose to represent the colors that we've chosen for use in our color scheme, because there are quite a few of those available to us. All that's really left to cover is how we might actually use these colors in rules in our color scheme so we can actually see our screen come alive. But before we get to that, there's one more color aspect that we need to touch on, because along with allowing us to specify colors in our color scheme, Sublime also has an incredibly powerful facility to blend and merge colors together. So in today's video, we're going to cover the Sublime Text color modification function. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here, and welcome to this video on the color modification function in Sublime Text. Now, what exactly is this color modification function? Well, if you remember from last week's video, we covered the variety of ways we have of choosing how to represent colors in our color schemes. There are 7 different formats we can choose depending on what we are most comfortable with, and we could use those to define color schemes, but potentially that might be a little bit error prone on our part if we decided we ever wanted to modify those colors. And let's face it, looking at RGB values or HSL values isn't potentially as elucidating as it could be if you wanted to look at a rule and see what it was actually doing. So Sublime allows us the ability to edit our color schemes a little more easily by allowing us to define variables that will take on those colors, so we can just use those variables everywhere. And now our color scheme is a lot easier to read, and it's easier to modify because we can modify those variables. But what if we took that one step further? What if we wanted to have not only reused colors, but also colors that are related to each other in some fashion? Or the ability to, in particular cases, modify a particular color in a certain way. We might have a certain particular shade of blue that we want to use for something, and in one of our cases in the file, we may want that to be a slightly dimmer version or a brighter version or a slightly color tinted version of that. And although we could choose such a color, that makes modifying that color harder later, because now there's 2 things we have to look for. We have to look for the base color and that one that we modified. And that's where Sublime's color mod function comes in, because it's going to allow us to derive colors based on other colors and change things like their saturation or their lightness or their alpha channel, and even blend completely different colors together to come up with whole new shades. And these can add a whole new level of dimension to how you choose to specify colors in your color scheme and make editing those color schemes a little bit easier. And this is mostly used in relation to creating those color scheme variables, but that is not anything that is strictly required. So you could just use this to come up with the values of those variables as well, as we will see in just a moment. So before we jump into that, just as a reminder, there's a lot to this, and we're going to cover quite a few examples here, but this doesn't cover exactly every potential use case for this. So make sure to make use of that documentation, the official documentation that's linked down in the description of this video and all of the videos in this series to get a little bit more information. And as always, I am using the package dev package. So as we're looking at the example code, we're going to see syntax highlighting in action in a color scheme file that you normally wouldn't see if you're not using package dev. So to get the full benefit of following along with these examples, you're going to want to use that package. So with all of that boilerplate out of the way, let's dive into what the color mod function is and what it can do for us. So what exactly is this color mod function that we're talking about here? Well, simply stated, it's a way for us to take some source color that we have defined and modify it in some fashion from that base to come up with a completely new color. And if it was really that simple, we probably wouldn't need a video about it, right? So we're going to go through quite a few examples here in the video. Before we do that, though, we should point out that essentially, this color mod function adds up to another way for us to be able to specify colors in our color scheme. If you recall from that previous video, there are 7 different ways that we can specify colors. We can use RGB hex or RGBA hex, or RGB or RGBA, depending on if we want to use the RGB color space and use hexadecimal values or decimal values. We can use the HSL and HSLA functions to specify colors in the hue, saturation, and lightness factor with or without an alpha transparency. And we can also use the CSS color names. That's 7 ways that we can choose a color and enter it into our color scheme. The eighth way, unofficially, if you will, to specify a color is to define a variable and then use the special syntax var and the name of the variable, which we saw in the examples in the last video, and we're going to see again in just a minute, to say that this color is actually whatever the value of that variable is. And a ninth way to do this is to say that we want this color to be some modification of one color modified in this way. So in anywhere in your color scheme where you might define a color, you can use any of those 7 or the variable or the color mod function to come up with the final color that you actually want. And which one of these you use is entirely, of course, up to you. Whatever is best for you in working with your color scheme, you're the one that's going to be working with it. Do what feels natural and is easiest to work for you. Now, we're saying that here because most commonly when you see someone using the color mod function, they're usually doing it in reference to a variable name. That's really where the power of this can come from, because it allows you to specify a variable by color and then modify it. And all of our examples are going to show examples of exactly that. But that's not strictly the case. So we can see up here in the sample file here, there's a variable named sample, which is using this color mod function. And we're going to get into more about what this is actually doing in just a moment, but it's taking this color in the RGB space and blending it with the named color orange. And that is what's setting the value of the variable sample. So we can use that there even though there's not a variable in it. And if you wanted to, you could use that same specification right in one of the color scheme rules without referencing any variables whatsoever. And that is just fine as well. And the same applies to all of the other methods for applying colors in here. Now, the color mod function itself takes first the color that you'd like to modify and then an adjuster to apply to that. And there are a few adjusters that we can use, and we're going to go ahead and cover all of those here. Now, to start off with, we've defined this variable named orange using the HSL function to be a color whose hue is 35, which is unsurprisingly orange. It's 35 degrees around the hue wheel, with a saturation of 50% and a lightness of 50%. And again, very quickly, the saturation value specifies how much of that color there is. When the saturation is 0, there's no color at all. It's just gray. And when the saturation is 100%, that color is as much that color as it can be. And the lightness value ranges from black at 0% through the 50% point, which is the purest form of that color with no black or white mixed, up to pure white at the 100% lightness level. And if none of that makes a lot of sense, it's described in the previous video in this series. You may want to backtrack and view that one before you view this one, and that will all make a little bit more sense. And so we can modify the saturation and lightness of a color as well as its alpha value by using these adjusters. And the color doesn't have to be specified in the HSL format to be able to do this. It will also work if you use the other forms as well, because remember, HSL and RGB are both 2 different ways of representing the same colors, essentially, whether you're mixing the red, green, and blue color channels together to come up with a color or specifying it by its saturation and lightness based on a particular hue. So down here, we're going to be playing with the rule for comments in the color scheme. And because all of these are currently commented out, the color that's currently being used is the one that is defined in Monokai, the color scheme that I am currently using, which is this sort of gray color. And so we can see that what we could do is say that we want to use our orange color. And because our orange is 50% saturated, it's not as vividly orange as it could be. It's sort of a mix between complete grayscale and the fully vivid orange at this hue. So these comments all change to have that particular color. Now, we can use this saturation modifier as the second component of the color mod function to say that we want to either specifically set the saturation saturation to some specific value, no matter what it currently is, or to adjust the saturation of that color up or down, depending on what its saturation actually is at the current time. And there's two ways to do this. Here I'm using the long form of the full name saturation just for explanatory purposes. But as you can see at that comment at the top of this section, you can always use the shorthand S instead to mean saturation. And which one of those you use is completely up to you. So now we're going to say that this orange color is the orange color, but with its saturation bumped from 50% up to 100%. And the result of that is this color becomes the most vivid orange it could actually be. So if you were using the original orange color for some things and you wanted sort of a brighter version of it, a more saturated version, you can easily do that here. And changing this value of the variable orange changes both of them. And again, we can modify the value up and down as well as just specifying a specific value. So currently the value is at 50%, but we're taking it down 30%. That sets the saturation to 20%. So when I save the file, we can see that this is mostly gray, but with a slight hint of orange in it. And we can also take that the other way. So the 50 base percent in the variable declaration bumped up 30% to 80%, and we end up with a more vivid version of the color, but not quite as vivid as the version where the saturation is 100%. We can see this one is just a little bit more vivid in that case. Its saturation is 100%. And in the same way that we can modify the saturation of a color, we can also modify the lightness of the color using the lightness modifier, which, much like saturation, has a shorthand version of L, but I'm using the full lightness name here. So again, we could see that the current color is this, which has a lightness value of 50%. That's right in the middle of that range. It's basically that color without tending towards black or white. So if we were to set the value of this lightness to 100%, the result is that the color changes to white, because regardless of hue, if the lightness value is 100%, that color is just pure white. It's so light that it just becomes the value white. And similarly, you can bump the lightness values down or up. So here we're taking the lightness from 50 down to 30. So we end up with a very darker color version of that. And we can also bump it up from 50 to 70, which makes it more of it's white, but with more orange in it. And it's also worth noting that when you're bumping both the saturation and the lightness up or down using this, it's important to put a space between the minus or plus sign and the following number. That tells the system that you're trying to adjust the value as opposed to trying to set it to an absolute negative or positive value, which will not do what you expect. And we can also modify the alpha value of a color as well. Now here, in our example, we're using the foreground color of what the value of the variable orange is set to, but without using the variable named orange. And that's just to point out that you don't need to use variables to use this if you don't want to. So here we end up with a 100% saturated, 50% lightness version of the hue 35, which is orange. This is the most vivid version of this orange value that we could get. And its alpha value is 1, which makes it completely opaque. Remember, the alpha value sets the transparency or opacity, depending on how you want to reference the value of the underlying color. When the alpha value is 0, that color is completely transparent, like air. You can't see it at all. When it's 100, it's completely opaque, like a brick wall. All you see is the color. And underneath there, to varying degrees, you can see the color of what's ever behind it. So if we were to take the value of this color and say that we want its alpha value to be 0.2, that makes it quite transparent, so we can see the background color through that vividly orange color, and the result is a very dim version of the color. And this is a sort of a common way to have a dimmer version of a color because no matter what the background color is used, the background color shows through. You end up with a dimmer version of the color, which might not work the same if the background color was a little bit different. And in the same way, instead of taking it down, we could take it down a little bit less, which gives us a dimmer version, because not quite as dim as the 0.2 version, because more of the orange is in there. Now, unlike the lightness and saturation values here, you can't adjust this up or down. You can only specify an exact value. The last thing to talk about here is the blend functions, and this allows you to take one color and blend it with another color to come up with a third color. And there's two different ways to do this, and which one you choose depends on how you want to affect the alpha channel. So we're going to start off by saying this. The foreground color for comments is white, so we end up with this completely white comment like this. And we say we want to modify the foreground color to be the color white, but blended with the color Dodger blue with a blend value of 0%. And that's specifying how the color mix is happening. And as a result of that, when I hit the save, we end up with Dodger blue, because what we're saying here is we want 0% of the white color blended with the color Dodger blue. So no white, Dodger blue, you end up with Dodger blue. And if you were to specify a 50% blend there, then you want 50% white and 50% Dodger blue in this case. So that is going to end us up with this same color, but a lighter version of it, because it's got white mixed in with it. And we can see that being the case here. This is sort of a lighter color. And the flip side of the first example is if we said we wanted 100% in the blend, then we end up with the white color we originally started with, because we want this color to be 100% white and 0% the Dodger blue color. Now, using this blend function like this blends the color values together, but it keeps the alpha from the base color, which is the first one, which in our examples is the color that's named white. So no matter what the alpha value of the second color that's being blended is, the transparency of the final color is always derived by what the transparency of that input color that was being blended is. Now, if we zoom back up to the top of the file for a second, we can see this variable that we have up here that's named faded, using the RGBA mechanism for specifying a color, 255, 255, 255, 0.5. That's a white color, but with 50% alpha transparency, right in the middle between being completely invisible and being completely opaque. So if we came down here, if we said that that was our foreground color, then we end up with what is essentially a sort of a gray color, because we can see the background color coming through the white at roughly a 50% ratio. If we wanted to blend the faded color with that Dodger blue at 50%, then we end up with 50% the faded white color and 50% Dodger blue, but the alpha is derived entirely from the first color, which is the faded color, which is 0.5 or a half. So we end up with the lighter shade of blue, but we can see the background through it, so it ends up being a dimmer version of the color. Now, if we did it this way, we're using the blend A function, which works the same as the blend function, except along with blending the color, it also blends the alpha channel together as well. So we're going to end up with a color that is a 50% blend of our white color and Dodger blue, and the faded color has an alpha value of 0.5. The Dodger blue color has an alpha value of 1. It's not transparent at all because no transparency has been applied. So when we save the file, the color gets lighter now because it's not as transparent as it was before. It's not 50% like it was the first time. Now it's 75%. It's a mix between the 50% and the 75% of the above. And using all of these mechanisms really adds a lot to our ability to specify colors, because as you can imagine, as you're working with things, you might want several colors in your color scheme to be sort of the same. You might want this color to be slightly dimmer when used in this area, but slightly more vivid in this other area. Or you might want to make other adjustments of that particular kind. And you might also want to be able to say, I want this color to be basically this color, but with a little bit of red added in because I'm going to use it as an error indicator in my color scheme. Whereas another version of it, you might want to have a little bit of yellow blended in as a warning indicator. And coming up with those colors is possible, it just to specify them as RGB hexes or HSL values. But if you decided you actually wanted the base color to change, then you have to go and manually find where you want those colors to look like now that the base color has changed. But using the color mod function, you can get Sublime to do all that heavy lifting for you. And now you could define your color scheme as some key variables at the top, modified where they're used, and you can easily make modifications and tweaks to the colors that you're using by just changing the variables. Kind of like it makes editing color schemes a little bit sublime. So as we can see, Sublime's ability to take colors and modify, blend, and merge them together is going to be really quite powerful when it comes to actually defining our color schemes, because it's going to allow us to have a few core set of colors and have other colors blend and derive and modify off of them, which makes editing your color scheme a whole lot easier. You don't have to do a lot of potentially error-prone find and replace operations if you need to tweak colors. You can just tweak a few near the top of the file in your variables section and have all the other colors immediately modify themselves as appropriate. All that's left now is to take these colors that we've defined and apply them to rules in our color scheme. And that is going to be the topic of next week's video. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you use those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share so you don't miss out on that video when it arrives. And remember, you can always use the comment section below the video if you have any questions, comments, requests for clarifications, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics. But until that next video, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.